No slideshow today. Sorry, Ryan Keene. Want to go over question that Scott put on my last YouTube post about hip extension. So Scott asked, why do pitchers throw out of different levels of hip flexion? Some throw out of more, some throw out of less. So I'm gonna pull up two guys, Jordan Hicks and Ronaldo Lopez, and just talk about the limb arc model and explain a little bit more of that, of what I've talked about in my last video and hip extension as well. Just because two of my athletes, Brian Eichhorn and Dylan Champagne, were confused. And I imagine maybe anybody else who watched the video might be confused as well. And that also ties into why I think people throw out of different levels of hip flexion. Some people will throw out of a position of trying to bias internal rotation with their pelvis in hip flexion. Some people will throw out of a external rotated bias in both sides being either lesser or greater than. And to explain why I think that, to go over the Lamarck model, will explain basically the reasoning here. So we take a pelvis and we take it lying on the ground. So we have everything up. We have everything up and at a zero line here. So everything is flat, pelvis is flat. We go up into 60 degrees of external rotation. The iliums are slightly open here. So this outlet is closing and the sacrum is going to slightly counter nutate. So it's going to extend backwards. When that happens, everything is basically opening. So that is just meaning that we're going through external rotation here up till 60 degrees. When we get to 60 degrees, say roughly right around here, and start going up into 90, 100 degrees, these iliums are going to come closer. Actually, better if I show it this way. So external rotation, opening up. This sacrum is extending backwards. So everything is getting here, open on the top side, closed on the bottom side. That's opening up space for external rotation here. As we go into internal rotation, the sacrum is going to flex. So it's already in a flex position. And then these iliums are going to come closer together, and that's allowing for more space for this femur to roll up into about 90 degrees to 100, 110 degrees of inflection. So it's going from external rotation to internal rotation. And then to finish it off, we're going to finish with external rotation. So we're going to go from 0 to 60 external, transition to internal. And then by the time we get up into our end range, just think about like what a butt wink is with the squat as well. We get to roughly about our end range of 110 to 120 degrees of hip flexion. We're going to talk a little bit. So this iliums are going to open back up. Sacrum is going to extend again, counter nutate. And that's going to create the final range of motion for hip flexion in the full degrees of that arc. And that's what the limb arc model is. It's just saying that we are transitioning from external rotation to internal rotation to external rotation. And it's through an arc of motion where everything is working in supination, external rotation. So say the ankle is in supination, plantar flexion, tibia is an external rotation, femur is an external rotation, pelvis is an external rotation. Then that stuff starts coming closer together as we start getting up to 60 and up until 100 degrees. Things are starting to come in close together. So the ankle is going to kind of dorsiflex, the tibia is going to internally rotate, femur is going to internally rotate, and adduct in the ilium and the pelvis is going to also internally rotate, and then it's going to go back. So think about a squat. When somebody squats, compensations happen for those ranges of motion at those certain degrees of movement. So initial descent, people have roughly 60 degrees of hip flexion. Everybody probably has that, so they don't need to compensate there. When somebody gets below 60 degrees of hip flexion and starts working about to whatever degrees there, say they're like getting past that angle where it's like what a high box squat would be, they're going to maybe turn their feet out to create a little bit more dorsiflexion or ankle pronation or tibial internal rotation so that they can get their knees to start working together, because they're in that position of the limb arc model where they're in the internal rotation bias of everything, specifically of their pelvis. And then, and then think about what happens at the bottom of the squat. People will butt wink. So tuck their pelvis underneath, create greater hip flexion, which is also another thing to try to create more external rotation. So if we think about the limb arc model in a squat, it probably makes more sense because you just look around, watch somebody squat. They're most likely going to compensate unless they're just a really good squatter. If they're a really good squatter, they are transitioning through those movements, but probably limited eyesight of like, wow, that's actually internal, or that's external, internal, and external. Most likely, if you look at somebody who's a bad squatter, you're going to see them try to cheat very heavily to try to carry some of those positions. Sometimes even the low back extension will also help them try to get into internal rotation that they might not have from joint to joint there. But everything, when you're in that certain degree of flexion, so say you're in 90 degrees of hip flexion, that is the most optimal angle for the body to create internal rotation. So when we're at 90 degrees of hip flexion, everything joint by joint is basically creating internal rotation. The ankle is pronating, tibia is internally rotating, femur is internally rotating, pelvis is internally rotating. So we think about that and throwing. Some people, like Jordan Hicks, will create 90 degrees roughly of hip flexion as he goes into leg lift and out of leg lift. I would call him just like a 90-90 guy. Then we have somebody like Ronaldo Lopez who doesn't do that. It creates a very high leg lift, gets up to like roughly 140 degrees of hip flexion in the leg lift. And as he drops down, I believe he's like 110 to 120, somewhere within that range. So he's a little bit more of like an external rotation bias, and Jordan Hicks a little bit more of an internal rotation bias. Just talking about the limb arc model and the way their pelvis is working and the way the joints are most likely working underneath that. But where this gets tricky and where this kind of gets thrown out the window, where it doesn't really matter, is everybody probably has to create a moment of external rotation or a moment of internal rotation. Somebody who is most likely internally rotated bias at their whole body, they're probably going to have to create a moment of external rotation for them to find greater amounts of internal rotation to produce force. Somebody who's externally rotated bias is going to have to create a moment of internal rotation for them to find more room to go into external rotation, create more space so they can produce force as well. Everybody is trying to produce force. Everybody is trying to get their pelvis to a certain degree of, say, rotation or hip extension for them to transfer energy to the front leg to block and then send that energy up into the upper half. But the most important thing that everybody is trying to do is to try to balance gravity and have their joints stacked on top of each other, since the most efficient way for movement and force to be produced is to have a stacking where the shoulders are on top of the hips are on top of the ankles and the knees, and everything is basically working like a helix where everything is kind of just like on top of each other, wound up, whether the angle changes front to back, side to side, whatever plane that we're in, everything just needs to be stacked as well as we possibly can. And I think Jordan Hicks stacks himself by going into a 90-90 hip flexion, 90 degrees, coming out of hip flexion, coming out of leg lift, staying in at roughly 90 degrees of a hinge. And then we go into Ronaldo Lopez. He's going into a little bit more external rotation bias. And with that, he's a little bit higher, coming down a little bit, still like a steeper angle there. And both of those guys are just doing different things with their bodies, but also looking relatively similar. The pelvis is still doing similar things. The spine is a little bit more juicy for Jordan Hicks. And I think that's because he shifts his center of mass back behind him as he hinges. But the pelvis is still like roughly doing similar things. There's still a moment of external rotation. Everything transitions from like a gait cycle of like mid stance to toe off to hip extension to timing that move up with the upper half. So with that being said, one thing that I want to dispel is that everybody hinges. The hinge is a load. Not everybody hinges. Some people squat, some people hinge. Some people have like, I guess hinge would be the internal rotation bias, squat would be the external rotation bias. Some people are doing different things, but like I said, the biggest thing that every thrower is trying to accomplish is stacking, and to be able to balance gravity and to be able to keep joint by joint everything into a position where they can open up space to then move into space and close that space as fast as they can with as good as timing as they can to be able to produce the best velocity they can over a long period of time with as many throws as they possibly can go through. But hopefully that answers the question to my knowledge. So far, this thing is so open-ended that I was looking into it for a week and a half, and I really couldn't figure out too much to go. And I filmed a video already, made it super complex. Now I wanted to dumb this one down because I don't even understand it completely. But that's what we got. Thank you all for watching and look forward to the next one.